Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Reuters event webinar focused on brand purpose. This is part of the Brand Marketing Summit, which is a fantastic kind of brand focused summit, which is going to be coming up later on next year. There will be over 200 marketing leaders and executives, and it is going to be focused across European brands and focused on brand marketing. Two of the speakers are with us here today, and I will just run through some introductions. First of all, we have Jeanette Liendo, who's the SVP of Marketing and Communications. Jeanette, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning. Very happy to be here to talk about a very relevant subject. Thank you for the invitation.
And we also have Stuart online, who Stuart Mcgowan is the Head of Marketing Intelligence for Philips. Stuart, do you want to say hello?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Looking forward to an engaging discussion. So I'm also looking forward to learning from everybody in the audience today, not only in terms of sharing what we've learnt along this journey as well. So looking forward to it.
Thanks, Stuart. And myself, I will be your moderator. I am James Sandberg. I am the founder of Customer Devoted, which is a customer engagement consultancy working with financial, tech, and retail brands. We help brands make better use of their data, automate their marketing, and build stronger, longer-lasting customer relationships with customer experience, CRM, and customer loyalty programs. Okay, now we're finished with all of the plugs. Let's get into the meat and the bones of this thing. First of all, I'd like to ask the most obvious question. First of all, to Jeanette, what is your brand's purpose and why?
So simply put, being part of the financial system, our brand purpose is inclusion. So making sure folks are included in the financial system, have access to a bank account, have the skills to be able to maximize their own economic situation. Gender inclusion is also part of that, as is digital inclusion in many parts of the world, including Europe. So in a nutshell, we try to do well by doing good as part of our core DNA as a company, thinking through how we can better people's economic situation through the products and services that we provide with our partners and with governments, essentially.
Fantastic, and I'm sure that there's a whole universe of kind of questions that the audience may have around this. Just as a reminder, we are fielding live questions for this, so if you do have some questions, just put them to us, and we'll try to get through to those as we go through the course of the webinar. How about you, Stuart? What's your brand's purpose and why?
Yeah, so it might surprise some of you in the audience, because maybe many of you know Philips for light bulbs, televisions, consumer electronics, but it might surprise you to learn that most of our revenue and most of the focus of our business is centered around healthcare. So the company mission is about improving 3 billion lives. We've actually set ourselves a target to reach that number by 2025. And the purpose that we set for ourselves is simply make life better, to support that ambition to improve 3 billion lives around the world.
That's a fantastic and highly aspirational ambition for the brand. And actually, I'm seeing quite a lot of commonality and sort of common territory between Mastercard and Philips. Really kind of focusing on kind of financial, financial betterment, but also improving lives for individuals. And I think, obviously, because you are leading brands, so you have that reach in the market, and you can take these large-scale initiatives and really push them forward. I'd be quite interested to hear from you both in terms of how you sort of have aligned your purpose to your customers to really make that purpose resonate and to really sort of deliver the brand impact. It's obviously in terms of Philips improving health and Mastercard's financial inclusion, but maybe you can go into a little bit more detail around that and flesh that out for the audience. I'll leave that to you first, Jeanette, if that works.
Sure. Like you just mentioned, James, we work through an ecosystem. We work with banks, we work with retailers, we work with governments. So whenever we try to create a product, whenever we try to run a campaign, whenever we try to think about anything we do, we try to put purpose at the core of that, of how will we help include people. And that can translate into many different scenarios. It's a different situation for people in different socioeconomic circumstances. So, and it's also a cultural difference. In Europe, we operate in over 50 countries, and for different people, giving back to society, what Mastercard gives back to society, or how Mastercard includes people in society financially, can mean different things. For some people, giving back to society and being included is, what are we doing specifically for them and their immediate family? How are we helping them? How are we giving them products, tools, abilities to better their credit, abilities to have better products that service their needs, to start small businesses, etc. There's another type of giving back or inclusion, which is, what are we doing to include more people in their community? And then for other folks, it's very important, and especially at this time of year, we see that peak most. What are we doing for the world at large to include more and more people in the financial system with access and with education? So one example of giving back that's very timely right now is our role with World Food Program. It's the part of the UN that lands on the ground during crisis. So during a hurricane or during a peak crisis, sets up operation, the electricity, etc., and essentially starts giving food, which is very, very important at a time of crisis. So the way that we try to help is, we are the world's biggest corporate sponsors of the World Food Program, and we try to constantly either help in a crisis or help by giving school meals. In the case of giving school meals, Europe alone gives about 30 to 40 million school meals to different societies in Africa and in Southeast and in Asia, and different each year. And the reason we do that is because we believe it helps break the cycle of poverty by ensuring children go to school in sometimes not the easiest circumstances to get to school and to send your child to school. Sometimes it's not always safe. So making sure they go there and they get fed is very important. And if they're little girls, we give an extra school meal so that they can take home to their family as an extra incentive for their families to send girls to school. Why do we do this? One, we believe people, if we can provide access through mobiles, etc., to become part of the financial system, they need education. So it's a form of financial inclusion. And two, it's always good to also champion gender whenever possible, to really try to balance out and make sure everyone is included. If we are going to be in a world of Internet of Things and a technology company, that has to work for inclusion for all in a way. And so that's an example. To your question, how are our partners included in that, or our customers? We do a lot of work with the banks across Europe so that they also enable B2B2C programs so people can donate. Right now in Germany, we have a promotion that's going on with Lufthansa. And there are many Lufthansa employees, Mastercard employees, and our joint cardholders have given over 2 million in this past month just to the World Food Program. And so that's a way that we can, with the ecosystem, partner up and drive a focused societal change we think is very important to meet the UN goals.
I think that's fantastic, and just kind of getting a sense of how you obviously sit in an ecosystem, so it's the nature of your business, but really kind of pulling together those partners and kind of making your brand purpose a reality. I kind of really hear that, and that sounds like a really powerful way of operating and bringing brand purpose to life. I would be interested to know a little around, you spoke about multiple different geographies and the ways in which you're operating. When we sort of take this down to a grassroots level, maybe you can sort of shine a little light on some of the cultural sensitivities and kind of executing that out into different markets. How do you go about making sure, because we all know culture is different. We need to be culturally sensitive. One size doesn't fit all. So how do you go about adapting your brand purpose and sort of running these campaigns in different markets and making sure they're effective from a cultural nuance perspective?
Sure. So one great opportunity we have every year is the UEFA Champions League final, which takes place in different places across Europe. In the Ukraine final, for example, in Kiev, what we found looking at the local grassroots situation is that with the war, so many soccer fields, so many places where kids could play soccer had been destroyed, that really what giving back and including those kids back into sport was really the number one thing that local communities wanted. So what we did is we teamed up with 12 local Ukrainian banks, and we set up pitches in 13 cities across the Ukraine, so that kids come back and the next generation of football players could play the sport. And that was the way that we activated that final, for example, in a very local way, and in a way that brings a nuance, which is a little bit different than a World Food Program, which is more of an umbrella campaign. In that case, it was about the passion of football. So we do a lot of passion marketing. And what's very important, because it's also true that, like you said, there's different cultural nuances, but there's different moments of experiences that consumers have. And in a final for football, they're thinking about other things. So we also try to make the purpose resonate in a very through the heart of the passion whenever we can, and drive our ecosystem to leave a long-lasting footprint in the country that is hosting the final, for example, and giving so much to us as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think it's also, really important that you look at that insight to make sure that what it is that you're doing is actually going to have that impact, because the insight is where you're able to drive the effectiveness through anything you do, including brand purpose. But touching on insight, Stuart, I'd be interested to hear how you have kind of looked at insight and the approach you've taken to align your purpose to your customers as well.
Yeah, I mean, it started off with really mapping out what, the area that we play in, and the way we see the world through what we describe as a sort of a health continuum. So Philips is really at the start of life. We have apps that support parents to be, and we support obviously parents through the early stages of their child's life. And we also look at the world and we say through that health continuum, it's about sort of healthy living, enjoying life. But then we're also there for the sort of diagnosis, the treatment, and hopefully the recovery. And so for us, it was important to get a framework together to understand, well, what is the role that we play? How do we make life better at all of these different stages of life? So Insight played quite an important role in understanding the different audiences and interpreting, okay, what does it mean to make life better? If you're an expectant father or mother, through to, if you're going through a very difficult time, then you need healthcare. You as a patient, what do you need then? So understanding the different audiences and what does it mean for Philips to actually make life better at those different steps was critical from an Insight point of view.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's move on perhaps a little bit and explore the actual kind of executions. We've spoken and heard from Jeanette around Mastercard's UEFA execution. Stuart, perhaps you'd like to flesh out a little bit in more detail how you've brought alive brand purpose in marketing channels that actually often would be seen as quite commercial / broadcast marketing channels. How have you brought brand purpose alive in marketing channels and done that effectively through areas like digital, ATL, just for the audience to get a sense of how this works on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas, you think about that sort of health continuum. I mean, one of the areas that we picked up on is something we call heart-safe cities. So if you take the US, for example, more than 7,000 people a week in the US suffer from a sudden cardiac arrest outside of a hospital. And the first 6 minutes after a cardiac arrest are actually crucial So, and obviously we make AED devices, so devices that help sort of resuscitate victims of cardiac arrest. So we actually sort of teamed up in a number of countries. So here in the Netherlands, for example, with the Dutch Heart Foundation, and we made sure that there was access to these devices in local communities, in busy shopping areas. And we teamed up with them, and we built a marketing campaign where we built up the awareness of how critical it is to get attention in those first 6 minutes, and making sure that people knew how to use the machine. So whilst it was sort of Philips sponsored, it was really the Dutch Heart Foundation making or building the awareness, and we were doing that in partnership to really get the message across, and to get the purpose, obviously improving lives or helping make life better, was very clear for us, because we're very strong in healthcare. So that was a very obvious one, I think, where we used traditional marketing channels, both the sort of digital campaign, but also TV, to literally advertise the issue, but also the availability, and to show what you need to do in those first 6 minutes, because it's also about knowing what you have to do if you see somebody fall down with a cardiac arrest.
Right, and I think that's it must be quite an emotive topic as well for all involved. And I mean, that in many respects, brand purpose, it falls outside of the kind of day-to-day operational side of stuff. I mean, you're not trying to just build awareness here. You're actually trying to create some social good. So perhaps you can sort of share a little bit around the how have you found that to be as a marketeer? You're getting much more emotionally involved in topics which in many cases I'm sure will be close to your heart anyway. So how's the experience of doing that for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because we see it. I mean, I think one of the spin-off advantages of having a purpose like make life better, and that big goal of improving 3 billion lives, we see it in our recruitment. So when we're talking to people about, why do they want to work at Philips, people want to be a part of a company that has that sense of purpose. So we're seeing that there's an added advantage of people wanting to join a company that has that sort of strong sense of responsibility, and has that clarity of, what are we trying to do and why are we here? And it's bigger than obviously the commercial objectives that we're very focused on as well. And I think you see it with your colleagues, so with your teammates, what do they want to be a part of? And so every sort of initiative, you can sort of ladder up and you can see how it serves that overarching purpose of making lives better, which then serves this sort of target of 3 billion lives. And we take it even further because we have it as an audited number. So every year in our annual report, we actually report on how close we're getting to that target of improving 3 billion lives. And there's literally a team within Philips that's basically counting the number of lives that we're improving. So we take it very seriously, and you see that the colleagues joining Philips also take it very seriously, and it gives everybody a shared sense of common purpose, which I think is what it's all about.
That's great. I've actually got a question from Alistair here, which relates to actually measuring this stuff. How do we, if you've got a digital footprint, it's easy to measure customer engagement. We all know how to measure session lengths and pages viewed and average order size, for example. But how do you? I mean, over to you, I suppose, actually, Jeanette. I'd be interested to know, because obviously financial is hugely metric driven. I've done a fair amount of performance marketing programs with financial brands. I know your performance data on digital. How do you translate this stuff into, the brand purpose side of stuff into hard metrics?
Sure, that's a very good question. And obviously different parts of Mastercard play into contributing for that. So in a broad sense, our immediate goal is to include 500 million people into the formal financial system. And so the way that we track that is how many people have we enabled to get a bank account, how many people have we helped get a digital ID, so that they can be part of the formal system, be building their financial profile, so to speak, to get access to resources, etc. When it comes to specific products, so we do a lot of products for small and medium businesses, we do a lot of products for entrepreneurs who are women, etc. Those KPIs are much more product KPIs. How many people have we included? How many people have been able to access different products and been able to really improve their situation? In a more communal approach, what we try to do is really help cities. So, for example, mobility within cities, helping people get around, helping the economy grow and mobilize is very, very important. Making that as sustainable as possible is very important. So, for example, in the case of London, we partnered with the London Transit Authority to enable 22 million people every week to use contactless and not have to top up their cards and et cetera, and giving a lot of efficiencies back to the city, but also helping the city move. In the case of sustainability, we just announced in the Madrid summit last week that we are going to partner with Dichotomy, a Swedish fintech that helps people track their CO2 emissions and actually become carbon neutral. And so in different cases, whether it's a product or it's a citywide initiative, there's different KPIs, but all up, it goes back to how many people have we included, how many people have been educated with the access provided, and how many people have actually been able to better their situation thanks to that different ecosystem playing at different moments in time.
Fantastic. So let's sort of let's go back to the kind of commercial considerations around this. The second part of Alistair's question is, to what extent do you believe customers can be influenced by brand purpose? You know, actually, how do you translate brand purpose into commercial impact, Stuart?
Wow, that's a tough question. I think you have to be quite careful with it because, I mean, you do see instances in the industry where some brands have got it really wrong. They've tried to hop on the bandwagon, and then you see consumers being very cynical about it. So I think there has to be a degree of authenticity there. In terms of, you know, how do you go about measuring it? I mean, I think brand purpose is really at the heart of your brand and at the heart of your marketing and what you're trying to do, and it should flow right the way through all of your activities. And then it becomes a part of your normal sort of suite of measuring the impact and the effect on your audience, and keeping a close eye on that and how it's moving over time. I think when you start asking questions about the level of influence, I think if you're trying to persuade people that you're something that you're not, I think as a brand you're in dangerous territory, because I think that's when if you're trying to create a fake purpose, I think consumers and customers see straight through that. I think you really have to have something that's got real shared values with who you are as a brand. You've got to have that sort of shared sense of responsibility in that area where that purpose might be, and it's got to bring clarity to what you're trying to do as well. But if you try and influence a situation and sort of hop on a recent issue that's not really associated, it doesn't have those shared values or shared responsibility, I think you run the risk of a backlash from consumers because they'll see straight through it.
Yes, not naming any brands, but that there was something sort of late last year which broke, which was owing to the brand's sort of history, their purpose-based initiative just didn't land. You know, it just did. So I think just the only thought I'd add to what you'd said there is, in terms of it, you know, being genuine and authentic, it's also, I suppose, brand legacy needs to be considered to a certain point. You know, it's what has the brand been and done and said in the past, because we live in a digital world, and whatever you said 10 years ago is on YouTube. So if it doesn't all line up to what you're saying today, your brand purpose can fall apart in ridicule. So really, really important in that sense, to make sure you're aligning with where you've been and where you want to go as well, I think. But I'd be interested to sort of get a little tactical now with you, if that's okay, guys. For the audience, I'd be interested for you to share some specific kind of advice and tips in terms of how can you bring this brand purpose alive in digital, in ATL and broadcast media, brand activations. We've heard a few specific examples, but I'd be particularly keen to hear what you have found to be the most effective in terms of reach and engagement. So what have you discovered in this area, Jeanette?
Well, I think one thing that's very important is to be very clear, and it's quite simple. And that goes back to the point that you both mentioned, that having the brand purpose be very, very close to the DNA of what the brand does every day, and to make it as concrete as possible. I think when you try to jump on the bandwagon, like Stuart says, something completely different, because it's a trend, it's a societal trend, and it's an important societal issue, but it's not tied to how are you doing business today, and how are you leveraging the network, in our case, to drive a better world. It gets very tricky. So there's a very important role of communications there, the thought leadership at the different levels, whether it's at a Davos or whether it's a cardholder in Greece. What are we doing to help them in a very financially driven way to create a better world with less inequality, with more opportunities, with digital being an innovation driver for inclusion, not for exclusion. That's, I think, very, very important. It's, I think, particularly important nowadays for tech companies to be very clear about the way they see the world, their values, and what they're doing about it, and the way they operate every day. I think, interestingly, one area that we see come up a lot as a key stakeholder in our brand purpose are actually our sponsorship partners. So as we all know, it's not only expected, it's demanded by consumers that more and more that brand purpose be clear and that it be meaningful, and that it aligns as much to the UN goals as possible, whatever a company does. But interestingly, the sponsorship space, which isn't really that close to purpose, it's coming up more and more. So for example, for UEFA, we are trying to work with the UEFA leadership team of trying to make UEFA as inclusive as possible for local communities and smaller clubs. We see a world, the same vision that they see, not only for the big clubs, but for the smaller clubs, really helping children, both men and women, so especially little girls, get confidence from sport, but also boys, of course. So really going there is very important for us to be able to sustain that kind of partnership with meaning. We also sponsor a lot of cinema. So in Europe in particular, we sponsor Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival, Venice Film Festival, and Berlin Film Festival. And the reason we do that with the higher ground is we think the world is a better place if the most people possible are exposed to the most points of view possible. So the more agility your mind has, the more points of view you're exposed to, the better the world is. And few things do that like cinema does, which is very different from watching a series. You really have to, for an hour and a half, see the point of view of a director or a writer and go there. And especially platforms like Cannes and Berlinale, et cetera, champion many voices of people who don't have a voice, point of view of people who have no societal voice. However, what does it mean literally for Cannes? So what are we doing to help the cinema industry? What does inclusion look like for cinema? We can't just, sponsor them and go away. How are we being relevant? So we have a nice construct in our campaigns, which is the Prices platform. And there's a specific part of every campaign we do, which is called Start Something Priceless. So of course we champion a lot of the iconic talents. We currently have a campaign going on for cinema with great European directors like Wim Wenders, etc., that we champion the priceless aspect. But our Start Something Priceless component is trying to look at how do we get more female directors who go into school, come out, and be able to become directors in real life, because lots of the statistics show, and they're better in Europe, but they're still not good enough. They're nowhere near good enough. That parity when film students enter across the genders to become directors or to be part of the film industry, but then at the end, very few women end up actually being able to be directors. And so how do we help people there? So concretely for the Berlinale, we sponsor the Talents platform, which is both men and women from different parts of the world who are at a point where they have been certified by the festival of creating great, amazing content, but they need elements, they need tools, they need resources to make it to that next step. And that's what we sponsor, whether it's a babysitter for a director to finish her film, or a guy to finish his script. He needs a script writer that's a professional, or an editor that's a professional, or that last mile. How are we helping more people get included to have more voices in the cinema industry? Also important. And I think that's an interesting angle that's not always obvious from looking at something that's can be seen as very prestigious, but not necessarily connecting back the purpose. So again, the role of communications is very, very important to be clear, for folks to understand what you're trying to achieve, to keep closely aligned to the DNA of your own brand and your ecosystem, and also what are you sponsoring, what are you delivering in that passion. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. No, some really powerful insights there. Just so the audience know, I've got a number of questions that have come in from you all, so thank you. We'll jump straight to that, but I'd also like to hear, first of all, from Stuart about some of the sort of grassroots tactics, things that you've done which you found to be particularly effective in execution for brand purpose campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, I've already given the kind of example on the healthcare side, on the Heart Safe Cities, but maybe you can switch over to the consumer side. And I think what's important there is the degree of consistency which we treat. I mean, we have a huge portfolio of products, over 100 different sort of product categories that we work with. So for us, it was important to create some focus and actually to articulate and demonstrate how those propositions actually do improve people's lives. So yeah, a very traditional. I'm sure a lot of the audience would recognise very sort of traditional way of looking at what is the insight, what's the tension that you're creating. And what's the solution? And for us, the solution has to be embedded in the framework of the purpose, which is, how do we make life better? So we did that this year and also last year. So if you take a coffee machine, for example, we talk about the importance of social moments and sharing with friends and family. If you talk about electric toothbrushes, not only are we talking about the technology and the sort of 60,000 vibrations a minute, but we're also talking about the healthy smile and the benefit of that. So we created a sort of a consistent campaign around that, about how do we make life better, and really articulated and dramatized how we go about doing that. And I think your question was also about, on a grassroots level, how do we make it work? And of course, we use some of the traditional channels like TV and so on to get the main message out. But we were very consistent throughout all of the other digital channels as well. And we sort of framed it around that typical journey. So, how do we create the desire that's linked to the purpose? If people are exploring it, if we've triggered that, how do they go about exploring that through digital channels and online, and mobile and social? And then have we got mechanisms to actually, at the last step, to tip over people into conversion? And I think linked to the earlier question and the discussion about measurement, I think it's no surprise that we're using a lot of the tracking techniques that many brands are using. but more and more, we're also getting more and more signals, more and more digital signals, so that we know that even if we look at, for instance, our media plans, within an hour or so, we can see search by hour going up. So we know that we're triggering interest. We know that the desire phase is working. It's helping people to explore more. And that for us was really important, because when we're sort of managing campaigns around this purpose, it's important for us to actually see that sort of instant effect, so that that you're building up something, you're building up that interest, you're building up that desire, you're building up the explore path, and ultimately into conversion, which is what it's all about. But I'd say I think the question was about what sort of tips would you have. I think making sure you articulate what that purpose is and being consistent throughout your marketing plan, which I guess is just the basis of all good marketing plans. And I think when you're using purpose, it's no different, but it comes back to the authenticity and the clarity, and being consistent with it.
Right, I think you articulated that perfectly. I mean, in the sense of, purpose through everything, through to how you communicate your purpose in terms of actual product messaging, right the way through creating that sort of engaging, explorative environment where people can sort of dip in, dip out, and see how it relates and connects to not only your brand, but also what you do, what you deliver, and what people can even purchase. So I think that's a really nice kind of strategic viewpoint there. I might jump into a few questions now. I've got a question here from Avnish, which I think is quite poignant, which is, the question is purpose-driven marketing for everyone, or only for brands with established credentials and business models? So, I mean, for example, insurgent brands or challenger brands are really focused on acquisition and growth marketing efforts, but let's consider throwing purpose into the mix. Does it belong in the mix? Does it not? So that question over to you, Jeanette. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you have so much freedom when you start a company in your toolbox to be purposeful, that I think it would be a tremendous opportunity to make sure that it is purpose-driven. It's, to quote kind of a classic, it start with why. Why are you doing what you're doing as a business? And if your business is contributing in some way, how can you make that contribution better? Many startups today, I think, more than ever, have that purpose driver. Well, can you do huge motions of cause marketing with a lot of investment when you're just building your base? No, but you can have a CEO who articulates the values, who's clear about them, who can have a vision of what they will do once they get enough of a base to contribute back in the industry or in the sector that they're in. I think it's a wonderful way to actually start something, if I may, priceless. But it has
Mastercard.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity, and I think at least a lot of the fintechs, the new banks that we see entering into the ecosystem, have very much an idea of how they want to contribute. And I would counsel, the sooner you can articulate it, if it's authentic, if it's easy to understand, and it's very driven by what you do, the better. It doesn't mean you have to prioritize it as your marketing investment per se at the beginning, but you can at least give a vision. I think so much in this day and age is about companies providing a societal vision that is powerful and positive, that can do a huge amount of good in the world. And I think if you want to grow a business today, you kind of need a purpose. If it's relevant to what you do, it's an accelerator.
I think I completely agree. I mean, I've read so many research reports now that are saying, we're in a hyper competitive world. Just look at every possible permutation of a product you can find on Amazon. And actually, you know, it is not enough to be generic. You need to be differentiated. And I think that purpose is a great way of differentiating the brand and also driving customer engagement. What do you think, Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of interpret the question in two ways. I mean, you've got this sort of the Byron Sharp school of thought, you know, where it says, you know, mental and physical availability is everything. You just got to grab hold of that in any which way. It doesn't matter which way, just get it, and success will follow. And then, of course, the second school of thought, which is it's more about purpose, which is related to, you know, what's the essence of your brand. And I think there are strong arguments for both. But the one thing that I've seen in my research over years is when consumers or customers are confused in any way, if there's any sort of anomaly or something that doesn't gel well with them, it creates a kind of a fear trigger, and they step away from the brand. So for me, that's the reason why I would err towards, of course, you know, purpose has got to be clear. It's got to give consumers the confidence and the trust that they're looking for, but it's got to be authentic. They've got to buy into it. So whilst I see a lot of value and a lot of merit to the arguments in the sort of Byron Sharp school of thought, I do think purpose is important as well.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on. I've got a few thought provokers for you both. So we see a lot of brands out there trying to prove their social and green credentials. We've already touched on this a little bit, but they can obviously sometimes be viewed skeptically. So you know, how does a brand avoid falling into the trap of overclaiming / jumping on the bandwagon and sort of shouting about credentials which are, you know, not justified? How can a brand sense check itself and make sure that when they get into purpose-driven marketing, that it really has that genuine depth and is effective? What do you think about that, Stuart?
I think you've really got to examine your audience and yourself, and you've got to be very critical of both to really understand whether those sorts of ambitions and beliefs, whether they be revolving around some sort of social need or whatever the definition of that purpose is, whether the two match, whether they complement one another. Trying to stretch yourself into an area which excuse me, trying to stretch yourself into an area that just doesn't hint, it's just not related to who you are as a company or what you offer, or something that just doesn't match with the beliefs, the values of your audience. I think when you get it right, and you really understand that audience, you really understand what you as a company are, and you've got that sort of shared common set of ambitions and beliefs that underpin your purpose, then I think you get a strong sort of amplification effect on the brand. But it starts with, well, I would say that, of course, given my role, but it starts with insight into your audience and the purpose as well.
Yeah, sounds like a sensible filter, making sure you're validating your sense checking with insights. Okay, so let's sort of consider the kind of the role of insight, I suppose, in terms of the process that you've gone through. I'd be interested, Jeanette, maybe you can chime in a little bit and share specifically, how did you go about identifying and fleshing out your purpose-led marketing initiatives? You know, specifically, how did you go about developing those insights that informed your initiatives?
Well, I think it depends on the campaign and the audience you're trying to deliver purpose to, in a way. So for certain audiences, being a brand that gives back to the world is very important as not a loyalty driver, but I would say a brand affection driver. So in certain segments, it's very important to demonstrate that we do contribute back to society, and using that insight to communicate back very clearly, what are we doing? A little bit to the point before, when you have an insight like that, I think it's very important how you communicate, so that you explain, well, you're not jumping on a bandwagon. You're trying to look at, for example, sustainability very seriously, and you're a champion within your ecosystem. So could that be as jumping on a bandwagon because everyone's talking about the environment every day? Maybe, but if you explain, okay, but what can I do with my card holders? What can I do with the plastics in a recyclable way? What can I do with people's emissions? How can I empower consumers to take their footprint into their own hand? I think if you're very concrete about what people care about, and we're seeing across Europe, the environment is very important. It's the one thing that people are most passionate about across all socioeconomic segments, all of them. So I think you have to be very concrete as an answer of why you're, if you're seen to be jumping on a bandwagon, why you're jumping on that bandwagon, because it's important, and exactly what are you going to do to fulfill that. That's, I think that's very important. And then the other measure of success, I think, is applying the same criteria our consumers, our partners, our governments do, is what did we do with what we said we were going to do? Did we do what we say, what we stated we were going to do, and how much impact did that drive? I think
it's having that accountability, and not only providing that accountability to yourself, but also, I'd imagine, because of the more sort of multi-stakeholder environment Mastercard works in, it's also kind of relaying that accountability through your stakeholder group. Is that right?
Correct, absolutely correct. And people believe more what you do. However, if you don't communicate why you're doing something and what you're doing, that's also a big miss sometimes. I see sometimes more brands doing great things that are not communicated correctly than jumping on bandwagons with bad intent in my career, and at least in technology. And so I think it's very important to be coherent, and for the different stakeholders, to your point, demonstrate the impact based on what the stakeholders are looking at.
And just sort of give me a sense in terms of, you know, when you bring your brand purpose initiatives along to your stakeholders, because of course you're working with card issuers, which are high street banks. How do you find working with them, aligning them, and getting their sort of agreements? You know, it must be very complicated because they'll have their own brand based initiatives that they want to run as well. How do you bring everyone along for the journey, Jeanette?
I think that one actually is not hard. I think we have a luxury in our legacy that we've been very consistent in inclusion for a very long time. So the World Food Program is something we started several years ago, and actually many of our key issuers, our key banks that issue our cards, are asking to do more with us. So they understand, they see the value. We also try to connect them as closely as possible to the impact that we're having. Our own leadership team last week went to Liberia to see the operations on the ground, what we're doing there, how we're impacting people. Our head of product, head of digital, all our different stakeholders and different people from the market. So if you keep it close and it's meaningful, and it's something that clearly has momentum and the authority like the World Food Program has in crises and setting up ops and really changing people's lives, I don't think it's so hard. And I think, in fact, for many institutions who see the state of the world today, they do want to contribute in some way. And so I think it actually is the reverse. If they see a platform that has accelerated mileage and purpose and is driving impact with scale, they'll also team up. We see that also in specific cities. Like I said, the London case, we have many cases like that in Europe where we team up and provide city insights of how the city can move better, how people can be more included, how people can be how the economy can be more transparent to be more inclusive, you know, by using payments, by using our rails, whether it's credit or debit or different products, the economy instantly is transparent. And many cities are looking for that so that it can balance out the society that they live in, and they can have a more profitable society for everyone. So it depends on the institutions, but we actually don't see much resistance if the proposition for purpose is sound and has been, if you will, verified by impact.
Sure. I mean, one of the things which is obviously worth mentioning for the audience is Mastercard and Philips both operate in hugely regulated environments, you know, and it's a very complex, both very complex markets, right? I mean, financial services heavily regulated, and healthcare, and it's not just that it's regulated in one market. All different markets have different regulations. So sort of trying to push things through on a global basis like this is, you know, is in particular in a multi-stakeholder environment hugely complex. But here we are, and we can see that it's possible to do. Stuart, maybe you can shed a little light on kind of working with multiple stakeholders and you know, any of the regulatory hurdles you may have had to overcome in any of these initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, from a purpose-driven marketing point of view, I think that's a sort of overarching guiding North Star, if you like, in what you are as a brand, what you're trying to achieve, what you're doing. And then, as you rightly say, I mean, healthcare is very local. You know, every single country has a very different healthcare structure, different ways of funding, different ways of executing healthcare. So for us, what's really important is making sure you give your colleagues in the local country, the local market, the autonomy to deal with what they need to deal with the different regulations and the different sort of guardrails that they might be experiencing in the local market. But at the same time, they have that sort of clarity of purpose. You know, what are we trying to achieve? How are we? What do we want to become as a company, as a brand? What are the values that we have? And then, of course, you give some room for colleagues in the countries to execute on that in light of whatever those local regulations are and what's relevant in their local markets as well. I think that's the important one. I mean, as a regulated industry, of course, we're paying very close attention to things like quality, but also to the rules set out. You know, there are things like EU MDR, there's FDA rules as well. So we also have teams in place that are interpreting those and giving that very strong level of instruction to teams around the world. But as I said, I think it's also important when you're talking about that in the context of purpose-driven marketing that people locally have the room to move as well. And that's where you see, when we talk about making life better, you see a lot of ideas coming up from our respective colleagues in the markets, but it's always there to support that overarching purpose.
Excellent. Okay, so I think we only have a few minutes left, but what I'd like to do is just quickly wrap up with one final question, which is thinking about the wider marketing mix. Actually, I'm aware of Robert Cialdini's influence book, and he sort of outlines six rules of influence that can help persuade people. One of those, of course, is the reciprocity effect. It's the pay it forward theory. Give before you ask. It sort of strikes me that brand purpose might sort of fit into this kind of area, and it would be quite interesting to hear how, first of all, Jeanette, how has brand purpose impacted, or what have you learned about how brand impact influences your wider marketing mix?
I think that's a great point, the give before you ask. So this is where, even though it's complex, it also is rather fun working in all these passions and in such a varied fauna of an ecosystem. I think there are issuing banks have played a huge role in giving first, and then we ask. So giving first, for example, in the Kiev example, we partnered up with 12 local banks to rebuild infrastructure for kids playing soccer, for football. And then we can do, then we have the permission to maybe ask local folks to contribute. But first giving and using the power of the financial system to do that, that's really magical. In terms of the mix itself, I think you have to be very careful in social these days. So how to influence people, I think the influencer aspect has to be very, very carefully managed. And for example, we did a master class in Cannes this year and in Venice, where we had iconic directors speaking about, both male and female, about how the transformative power of cinema. And what we tried to do is really get influencers who are deeply involved in the cinema and film industry to come because they wanted to come, not because we paid them. And that had a huge reciprocity effect. So I think that that brand safety element of, are people who are amplifying your message, are they on brand? That I think is something that you have to be not only careful in digital formats, but also through your influencer channels as well. Because they're also a reflection of the brand as well, if that makes sense.
Right, absolutely, yeah, definitely. And how about yourself, Stuart? How has the pay it forward model using brand purpose had an impact or influenced your wider marketing mix?
Yeah, I mean, for us in healthcare, I mean, there's quite a lot of that. I mean, there's a couple of examples that spring to mind. Where, I mean, if you think about the number one killer of children under the age of 5 is childhood pneumonia. So through our foundation, we're sort of helping out that purpose, if you like, of improving lives of children around the world. And it doesn't necessarily have a direct effect on our sales or anything like that, but it's very, very dear to our hearts and our purpose, because we're helping out with antibiotics, with education, because to notice the early signs of pneumonia, and of course there it's important to recognize it so that you can treat it. So whilst it's not something that's directly linked to our business, it's not that we're selling something off the back of it. So that sort of idea of reciprocity and paying it forward, we're helping something that is related to, making life better, improving people's lives. So yeah, I mean, it definitely has a role to play in our marketing mix. I mean, it's sometimes, I guess, the lines start to blur at a certain point with sort of corporate social responsibility, of course. Because you start thinking about, okay, how are we as a responsible brand? I mean, all of the electricity that we use here in the Netherlands, where I'm based, it's renewable now. So all of our factories, all of our R&D sites, all of our offices. So again, that's not something that's directly linked with the purpose of selling, but as a responsible brand that links to, well, we take our responsibility quite serious in improving lives, also on a more broader definition. How do we operate as a business? How do we operate responsibly as a company? We also have a concept of, I think many people have heard about it, the circular economy. So even when we're looking at, okay, when we decommission some of these devices that are in hospitals, we're looking at how do we harvest all of the components and either reuse them or make sure our impact on the environment is minimized. So again, it's about sort of paying it forward and being true to your purpose in improving lives, not just in the propositions that you have and how do they improve lives, how do we get closer to those 3 billion lives, but also, how do we operate responsibly and conscientiously. So in terms of the marketing mix, I think it's probably something we don't necessarily shout about. Of course, we make it known. And I think more and more, I think similar to what Jeanette was talking about and some of the work that Mastercard are doing around the world, it's almost expected of brands to be responsible. People want to be associated with companies and brands that have a true sense of responsibility in the way they operate as well, and that needs to be linked with whatever that purpose is that they're serving as well.
Excellent. Well, yes, lots of strong insights and great guidance for the audience to start considering how they can either launch or refine their existing brand purpose initiatives. We have gone over a little bit, so I'm going to have to wrap up now. That just leads me to thank Reuters Events for hosting this webinar, and also both Jeanette and Stuart for being fantastic speakers and sharing their thoughts on brand purpose. Thank you both. Do you have any final thoughts, Jeanette?
No, thank you very much for the invitation, and it was a real pleasure.
Excellent. How about yourself, Stuart?
Thank you. I thought it was very thought-provoking because you raised quite some important questions for brands today. So just happy to be a part of it and to be part of the conversation. And apologies for my voice this morning. It's a bit ironic that the guy from the health tech brand is not sounding very healthy today. So.
Well, you came through all loud and clear on my side. I'm sure that's the case for the audience. Well, thank you both, and thank you for the audience for tuning in. That concludes today's webinar, and I am now going to be closing the session. Thank you all.
Okay, bye-bye.